My name is Nate Walck, and I'm a systems engineer at Facebook, which is now an umbrella term for basically everything that CP does and everything that we used to do on core automation. But I'm going to be talking about easy macOS management. It's a little bit more detail on what Greg touched on in his talk. So one of the biggest questions is, how do I get started with Chef? And that's a very good question and very complicated question depending what you want to do. So we made a very simple getting started. So you can run Chef, you can download, clone a repo, and run one command basically, and get started with Chef within seconds. It's really quick to go through the getting started and start playing with our cookbooks and seeing how they work. So one of the first things you need to know about using API cookbooks is attributes. And attributes are really, they're data structures, Ruby data structures like hashes and arrays. So let's assume nobody here has any Ruby knowledge whatsoever. There's two major data structures, as I mentioned. We have hashes, which are known as dictionaries in other languages, and we have arrays, which are generally arrays in most languages. So let's briefly go over each one and how you interact with it using Ruby/Chef attributes. So hashes are a key value pair. This is how you assign a key with a specific value. Basically, it's just as simple as that, but we'll go through the different objects here. So our node object is what contains the hash. It contains the hash of key, and we're telling it to use the default precedence level, which in Chef, there's a couple things I'll get into a little bit regarding different attribute precedence levels, but don't worry about that right now. We're just setting node default, and inside the square brackets is the name of the key. In this case, we're really imaginative, so our key name is key, which is in single quotes. It could be, which is telling us it's a string. It could be in double quotes. It could be an object that contains a string. You can pass things along just like you would in Ruby or Python. It's a very similar concept. Finally, we're setting the key to be equal to value, which is also a string. So let's use this to describe what we want. So would I like some sushi? Yes, please. So we have a true value, which is bool. So sushi, the key, is set to true, which is a Boolean value. Bacon preference? Well, because I'm here, it's round. Hashes can be nested, meaning one hash can contain a series of other hashes. So a key can contain, as its value, another hash, which is another key value pair. So what that does is it gives you this really nice visual look at what it is that you're doing. So for instance, if I go to Tim Hortons, do they have coffee? Yes, they do. True. But Tim Hortons also has tea. So we have another value there. They all belong to Tim Hortons, but it's two different options, coffee and tea. Sadly, they don't have iPads, although there may be people using them there, I don't know. But we can't purchase them there. We have to go to an Apple store for that. So that's just a basic look at how attributes work and how the namespaces work from left to right, to describing what it is that you're setting and what you're setting it to. So when it comes to using our API cookbooks, there's a few things to keep in mind. Always set the attributes in a recipe. This is extremely important. I won't get into the details now, but you can ask me later, and I'm happy to go into it. But just remember, if you're setting an attribute for the API cookbooks, always do it in a recipe. Don't do it anywhere else. When you Google, you'll find different answers on it, but this is the Facebook way of doing API cookbooks in Chef. And definitely don't put it in attributes/default.rb. That is for the person who wrote the API cookbook. It's where they put default values, a scaffold to show you what values are available, and maybe even sane defaults. So don't ever change it there. You should never have to modify the original API cookbook in order to get done what you're trying to do. And then always use node default. And as I said, this gets complicated. There's 6 different levels that you can use, and then different contexts within there that these can be used. So it's just a huge pain. And when I say it's confusing, this is what it looks like, right? So you have default, force default, normal override, and force override. And then you have 4 different contexts that each of those may or may not be usable in. It's 15. So just no, don't do that. It's just a huge pain. And I'm not that clever. I can't follow all that. I can't keep all that in mind when I'm looking through code. So just don't even bother. Just node.default. So where do the attributes go anyways? So if I'm not supposed to put them in attribute/default, but they have to go in some recipe, which I don't know which recipe, where should they go? So if you're following along using the example that we have, you would put them here. So we have a cp-init cookbook, and then it has a recipe called company_init. And company init is where all customizations go for your company. So in cp-init, we have a run list, and the run list calls a base recipe called default, and then it calls company, which then can modify everything that's in default. So right here, what we're doing is we're not actually setting anything. When you do a chef run on a fresh clone of this repo, it either sets nothing or it sets it to whatever the system default for OS 10 is, or macOS, sorry, in the first place. So for instance, let's say we want to set the desktop wallpaper. You have no default, CPE desktop, which is the cookbook. The option we're setting is override picture path, and we're setting it to a picture. So if we break it down again, this is the cookbook name, and the cookbook owns that namespace, meaning the only thing you should find in CPE desktop is things related to managing desktop-related settings. The actual value is override picture path, and the value that's the key name, and then the value for that is the path to the JPEG. And if you look at the profile that this generates, it actually generates a profile and installs it. The key in the profile will be override picture path, because that's what it is for the actual setting. So it's extremely dynamic. Anything that's supported, you could use here. But in this case, we're just doing override picture path. So the end result, we run chef. It installs the profile. The profile changes the desktop wallpaper. And in fact, if someone's logged in because we're using a profile, it just changes magically before their eyes. There's no having to bounce you don't have to have bounce dock or anything like that. It just works. So let's look through some of these other cookbooks. We can get to the sweet results of managing macOS with Chef. Here's preference panes. And so let's say we want to disable some preference panes. Say you don't want them to be able to get into profiles or iCloud settings or desktop settings for whatever reason. We feed this a list of preference pane identifiers, and it will go ahead and disable them for us. So we put this into our company init, just as you see it here, and it will add all of those to a profile and have it disable all those preferences. So we haven't run Chef yet. This is what it looks like inside of our profiles preference pane. We're going to go ahead and run Chef, and you can see there's nothing disabled. So we'll run Chef. Profile shows up, it's preference panes. And when you look at the preference panes, you can see that these three are now disabled. They're grayed out. It's a little bit hard to see, so I highlighted them for you. Desktop and screensaver, iCloud, as well as profiles, they're all disabled. Well, that's great. So what happens if we really decide we want them to be able to get to desktop and screensaver settings? Because that's not really super security related. There's going to be no data leakage. They're not going to remove management. So let's go ahead and remove the desktop screen effect one, and that leaves us only with iCloud and configuration profiles. So we take them out, we save the file, we run Chef again. And now, lo and behold, you can get to desktop and screensaver again, while the other two remain disabled. So what we're doing here is when you remove the configuration, it reverts only that piece of the configuration. So if you have 3 things disabled and you change it to 2, it ensures that only those 2 things are actually disabled. It cleans up after itself. It's pretty nice. Let's look at screensaver, another very common setting. So CPE screensaver automatically manages it to the system default, which is like 600 and password delay of 0. So we're going to set this. We'll save it in our company init file. Idle time of 300, ask for password delay 2. This is what it looks like before we've actually run Chef. You can see it's 0 and 600, which is system default. And then we're going to run Chef. When you run Chef, it flips those values for you. So now it's a password delay of 2 and an idle time of 300. And if I were to remove those settings, it would revert it back to the 600 and 0 defaults. Power management. Greg touched on this with our dashboards and other non-user assigned machines, just like public display. So we can manage things both while on AC or on battery. And you can see from left to right, it's power management and then AC. So anything within the AC key applies to that state. So we have system sleep timer of 60 seconds while plugged in, and we have a system sleep timer of 30 seconds while on battery. So that way we don't drain the battery quite as much. So if we were to run this, you would have a profile called power management that would be installed, and you'd see the settings listed, much like we saw with idle time. Here's another one of my favorites. I check out code, and Spotlight and code don't really get along all that well. So it always tries to index these gigantic repos I may or may not have checked out at the time. So I'm going to exclude that. I put everything into my tilde code directory so that I have a nice place to keep it. And then if you run Chef, you'll see in system preferences that my code directory is now actually there. And Spotlight is skipping that. It's no longer indexing that, no longer thrashing my CPU. Everything's happy, more or less. Again, with dashboards, you can disable the keyboard auto-seek, and you can disable the mice. The nice thing about this is when you disable these two keys, it also prevents it from popping up saying, we're looking for a Bluetooth device because there's nothing plugged in. That's a lot of fun if you have a device that really does have nothing plugged into it because it's on the wall, and you don't want to have to go into there and run around with keyboards and plug it in and disable all that stuff. So we provision it in this state, and then it just doesn't pop up and ask for Bluetooth keyboards or mice. Paths D is another one. So let's say your company has an internal command or binary that they add. You want everyone to be able to have it just by default in their path. So if they open up terminal, they type the name of the command, it should just work. They shouldn't have to go hunting for where the command lives. So here my binary lives in opt_nate bin, and I want to make it available to everyone in the company. So I'll just add it to paths D. And this is an array, so we're doing the double redirects over to paths D. And when I echo my path, you can see at the very end of it, it has opt_nate bin. So anybody who uses this machine, open up terminal, and if you echo path, you'll see that this custom path is there for everyone. It's at a system-wide position. Another one is hosts. I actually didn't know about that Reddit and Hacker News example. That's kind of great. But let's say you have an internal server. Your DNS may not work well, or you don't want to depend upon it. You could add specific DNS names for the IP addresses. So here we have 1.2.3, and we want example.com to point to that. Or you can do multiples, because it's an array. You can do 1.2.3 and example.com and example.org, and they'll both point back at that IP address. So this is what it looks like when you cat etc hosts. You can see there's 1.2.3, example.com, example.org, and it says managed by Chef. So that way, if someone goes in here and they're trying to change it, and then it keeps getting put back, they'll still rage, I'm sure, but at least they know why it's coming back. It's just not magically showing up. LaunchD. One of the things that we added to Core Chef was the ability to create LaunchD jobs. And then adding to that, we made a cookbook called CPE LaunchD. And what it does is, just like all the other API cookbooks, if you put a hash with a bunch of settings in it, it generates a LaunchD on disk for you and loads it. If you were to remove those values from your company init file, it would then go unload the job and delete it off the disk for you. So you don't have to remember to clean it up. No rogue LaunchDs running around that you don't remember having made in the first place. So it looks like this. You have CP LaunchD, and then you have SumScript as the key name. SumScript is what it uses to generate the LaunchD label. Then within SumScript, it's a hash of data. So we have this curly braces. And within there, you want to specify programs. So just like on a LaunchD, you have a key program, and then a value of whatever you want it to run. This could be a binary, it could be a script, anything that LaunchD accepts. Then when do we want it to run? Well, the key start calendar interval is extremely useful, and that's a hash itself. So this is a good example of a nested hash. We have a program that's a key value, and then we have a start calendar interval that is a key, but it also contains other hash values. For instance, what weekday, which hour. So this nesting actually matches how LaunchD writes out the plist on disk 1-to-1, and I'll show you exactly how that matches up in a little bit. But so here we want weekday 7, which is Sunday. Could be 0 as well, either way, for Sunday. And then an hour of 10. So we want it to be at 10 a.m. every Sunday. And then a timeout. This is a long-running command. Sometimes it hangs. Sometimes our end users will hate us if we let stuff running too long and consuming CPU. So we'll do a timeout of 300 seconds, which is about 5 minutes. So I run chef. It generates the launchd dynamically, puts it onto disk. And this is what it looks like. So if you notice, the label has some script in there as the end of the label. The first part of the label is completely dynamically generated. So I set my company, my organization in company init, which you'll see as an option if you clone it down. So I set my company to OS10 DevOps, and it automatically makes a com.os10devops.chef, and then adds the name of the script for you. So we set each of the settings in company init, but it assembled it for us to generate the launchd. So I don't even have to think about it. I just name the script, and it does it for me. So the program keys here as well, as you can see. Key of program, value is a string, which is the path to the script I am running. And start calendar interval is set exactly to what we have. And as you can see, it's nested here as well. It's a key that contains a dictionary of additional keys. But in Ruby parlance, it's a hash of hashes. So we have hour 10, weekday 7. Finally, timeout key is 300 seconds as expected. So every single key we specified in the hash correlates one-to-one to keys in the launch statement, but it has a lot less plist cruft around it. It's just straight Ruby with curly braces. And the best part is, as I said, if we were to delete it, the entire key, this would remove the service from someone's machine. So in CP user customization, say someone hates this script or binary that we're running, they could just delete that key in their user customization, and it wouldn't manage that anymore. If they ever had it, it will unload and delete it. If they never had it, so if it's a new machine, they just won't get it because they're deleting it out for their user. So what about managing web browsers? This is a lot of fun. So for that reason, Nick created CP Chrome, and then we also have one for Firefox and Safari. But Chrome is probably one of the best examples because their API for managing Chrome is extremely robust, unlike some other ones. So it uses a configuration profile, and it uses the manifests exactly as Google has documented on their Chrome page for managing it. So here we're going to do bookmark bar enabled. It's the namespace CP Chrome. The key is bookmark bar enabled. Value is a bool of true. So that just means that bookmark bar is shown by default. So perhaps, quick on the trigger. So perhaps you want to force install an extension like one of our users didn't like. You can tell it the update URL for the extensions, and then you give it the identifier for the extension. And here we're making sure that LastPass is always installed on our machines, but because we're pointing it to the update URL, it also makes sure it gets updated. So that's great. What about if you have a really bad Chrome extension that's doing something really nasty? You could block that for the entire fleet just by putting the identifier there. So no matter how hard someone tries, they can't install that extension. And if they try to get out of this, we know it's a bad one. Security will probably yell at them if they try to disable it. So we're all covered on this side. So, extension no longer installed. This one specifically is Better History, which I just found randomly. But yeah, that's one of the ones that we block. And you could even feed into this. Something I did not make an example of because everybody's internal network is different. But say you have a list of bad Chrome extensions that you can just grab from some web server. You could do that directly in this code. You could pull that list down and then add, iterate this attribute and add a list of all those different bad extensions. So that way you could update it in one place, and then Chef will dynamically disable all those extensions using the identifiers. So we've made quite a bit of progress in the last year, and API cookbooks, we're getting more of them created and open sourced. We have quite a bit of work we want to do still. For instance, CP Screensaver only supports macOS, but we want to also be able to support Windows. So you can set the idle time in one place, and if it's on Mac, it knows what to do. If it's on Windows, it knows what to do. If it's on Linux, it knows what to do. That's the end goal, having a standardized API for managing all platforms with a minimal amount of effort. Also, I want to give Eric Gomez a shout out. He's written quite a few API cookbooks that use the MDM style keys for them. So some of the ones we have are still the old MCX style, the MCX to profile tool from Tim Sutton. But there's a lot of new keys and payloads that support doing that stuff more natively. So if you're doing it in Chef, and for instance, you can no longer use Chef, you could at least migrate it over to an MDM if you needed to. Oh yeah, another one that Eric has that's really cool is application access control for iCloud, and also blacklists. So just like if you don't, I know in Casper Suite, and then there's another, the old payload that they had, one of the first payloads was listing apps you couldn't open. He has one for that as well. So you can just put the name of an application in there, and it'll prevent it from being opened. And there's also another one that's touch bar layout. So if you want a standardized touch bar layout, it's managed in code. You can just do it in Chef using key value pairs to describe what order you want things in. And everybody has the same touch bar layout that way. And if they want to modify it, or they want that to follow them from machine to machine, they could manage it in something like CPE user customizations. And then they never have to, manage their touch bar again. It just follows them every time they upgrade. But the good news is more and more people are starting to use Chef outside of Facebook. And that means that we're also getting a lot more contributions and a lot more issues and a lot more stuff that'll help make it all better in general. But that's a little bit of where we're headed and what we've done so far. And I know in probably the next 6 months to a year, we'll have even more stuff open sourced, and perhaps some of even our auto promote stuff, outside of the Chef world. Any questions?
Questions? No questions?
So, Nate, what, if any, is the policy with regards to the tools you're developing internally to open source them?
Good question. So the auto promote's one. I think auto DMG cache builder is already open sourced. So that can basically build images, yeah, right? So we're looking to move away from that. But eventually we'll have some more tools that we're building just around 10.13. And I think we're going to be designing them with open source in mind. One of the problems that we had is when we build stuff without open source in mind, it's too easy to put internal stuff into it. And then it's really hard to decouple it later. So to answer your question, I think auto promote's the biggest one. Can you guys think of anything else that we have that we were going to do outside of Chef? I know API cookbooks are the major thing we're trying to get standardized and cross-platform and get released. Oh, yeah. Was that? Oh, right. Yeah, sure. So open source in general, we have OS Query, which we use for gathering system data. And one of the dashboards that Greg showed was actually pulled from OS Query. Basically, you can get a list of all apps installed. It's a select star from apps, and it'll show you all the apps that are on the machine. And then you can ship that back wherever you need it to be. So we kind of replaced, we had Monkey Report. We've been using that for a long time, and it's served us well. But we're trying to use more of the internal tooling. So then once we're using it, we can make more examples on how to use it effectively, and then have those for the community to use as well. Oh yeah, Nick just released this. He just pushed this. But for Adobe CC, he has it set up now where you can click install and manage software update for Monkey, and it will use Adobe's API and grant that software to that person's account that's currently logged in. And then when you hit remove, it revokes that software from their account. So it does it both ways. And that's pretty fantastic. When I saw that, I was like, woo, that's like really cool. Because, it's much better than having to deal with building all those packages. You just put it on their account, remove it from their account, and it's all tracked pretty well that way.
Questions? And we're done.